If you are into forensics, you absolutely have to watch Exhibit A. This is a 4-part documentary on Netflix, and I absolutely thoroughly enjoyed it. I will not spoil it in terms of going into the severe details of the cases that are covered, because I think that's one of the interesting aspects of seeing which real-life cases they use to highlight the points that they're making. But I will say it's definitely worth watching. It also shows the flaws with forensic science and the problems that it can face with wrongful convictions. And I will, towards the end of this video, I will give some spoiler thoughts, but I will give you a warning when I get there. So the 4 episodes look at 4 different things. We have video forensics, which I thought was really great because I learned a lot. I've read many books on forensics, I've watched a lot of documentaries. I needed fresh meat. And the video forensic aspect obviously is quite one of the more modern aspects of forensics, even though the discipline itself is quite recent anyway. But I did actually learn quite a bit about how this is going to sound like it's common sense, but about how the angle of the camera can make a person look taller or shorter than they actually are. And that's coming out my mouth, that sounds common sense, but the way the episode describes it and visualizes it, it's interesting to consider, and it shows why it's, a lot of people are convicted because of CCTV evidence. But this, it really is fascinating. The second episode is called Blood Spatter, and this looks at blood spatter, or blood pattern analysis, which is one of my favourite aspects to study. It's so fascinating. As the name suggests, it's all about the way in which blood spatters when you hit somebody, or shoot somebody, or stab somebody. And I didn't learn too much in this one, so if you're already very familiar with it, it might not be very helpful. However, there is something spoiler-based for this that I would like to go into. I'll talk about that at the end, so I don't ruin anything just now. But I did learn a few little things, something about the way it would go backwards, but in a kind of conical shape. I found that really interesting. The third one is Cadaver Dogs. I didn't really feel like there was much for this one, but one of the mother of the young victim didn't really like the use of the cadaver dogs because it gave them a false, or what she believes to be a false outcome for her missing child. And you can see why that using the cadaver dogs would be quite problematic. But to be honest, it didn't really look too much into how the dogs are trained. It did a tiny bit, but not in enough detail that I could confidently say this is how a cadaver dog is trained from puppy to qualified. It didn't really show too many cases where it was either successful or proven to be unsuccessful. I think it was basically just a chance to show off some really adorable dogs. So that episode wasn't too great, but it was interesting, but for me that was more victim-led and really quite emotional. And the last one really broke my heart. This is Touch DNA. Obviously, every contact leaves a trace, and it's all about this man in Brooklyn was really savagely attacked. It was a hate crime, and it's a really emotional story, and he's alive. He gets to give his own story, but it's very difficult to watch emotionally. But it looks at how certain DNA, with every contact leaving a trace, led to what could have been a wrongful conviction and not getting the right people, and a little bit of corruption involved as well. So that one was really interesting. I'll be honest, it doesn't go into that much detail about DNA. It doesn't look at your loops and your whorls. It's not really going into hair follicles or skin cells. It didn't really go into that much detail. But because of the level of emotion in this story, it was an enjoyable episode in that aspect. So not very educational, but very, I feel bad saying enjoyable, but it was interesting, I guess. So Exhibit A, if you are completely new to forensic science, you will learn a lot. I think there's a lot in there, certainly in the blood spatter and also with video forensics, which even as somebody who's read a lot around forensic science, I still learned quite a bit, so I thought that was really interesting. The last two episodes, the Cadaver Dogs and the Touch DNA, I thought were quite weak. They were a lot more victim-led than the first two episodes, so it's kind of a switch in tone. It's very different. It's a very different approach. And I guess ending the series on an emotional note is going to have an impact. But it's definitely worth watching if you're new to forensic science. I don't think it's too technical that you need any real prior background knowledge. But even if you're very familiar with forensic science, unless you're perhaps a forensic scientist, I'd say it's completely worth a watch. So the spoiler thing, I'm done talking about everything else, just the one spoiler thing from now. In Blood Spatter, when that, I feel awful, I can't remember her name, I'm very sorry, but when the woman in Texas, after 20, 30 years, however long it had been, was convicted of the murder of her husband, just because there was a small speck of blood on her nightdress. They did not properly analyse that. Most people at some point will get blood on most of their clothing. You cut your finger, you have a nosebleed, you bite your lip, whatever, you get a spot or a scab. Most of us will get specks of blood on our own clothes at some point. Unless they could test that blood, conclusively say it was the husband's blood, and then somehow work out how it would have got on there after he was killed, without it just being a coincidence, because it's really circumstantial. It's like they needed to convict somebody, so they did it. And I think that's disgusting. And more importantly, if she did, even if she was the murderer, after these many decades, she's not done anything wrong, she's not harmed anybody, with no solid evidence, surely community service at the very most. The fact that they didn't listen or follow up to the death threat that was made days before, like, how pathetic can you get? I get really frustrated when law enforcement does not do what it obviously has to do. And I am a big advocate of the police force in both Britain and America. And I know that there are problems though. Especially in the 20th century, there were a lot more problems then than there are now, which is saying something. It breaks my heart. I hope she's released. She's never been incarcerated. Even if she did do it after 20 years, what's the point in putting somebody in prison and making her family, her young grandchildren suffer something that they can't even prove she did? It's despicable. However, apart from that, the documentary series is thoroughly enjoyable. Exhibit A is interesting, partially educational, and for the most part, very emotional.